This is a question I guess kind of for both of you. So for Quan, I saw in your chat book that you put your name in like 2 different ways. So I was wondering, like, when you're doing these translations between English and Vietnamese, how do you navigate like the different conceptions of like naming between like these two cultures?
So I think in that way, it's a mirroring, right, of these dual identity, but they are one person.
Yeah.
So, for example, in Vietnamese, my name is actually last name first, middle name, and then first name. And then when I went to the U.S., I remember the teacher calling my name from roll call, and I didn't respond because that was not my name, right? I didn't hear the name, and so I think in the decision to do that, it is a decision about self-representation, but it's also an acknowledgement, right, that who I am has also been changed over time, that is not static. And in translation, whatever work that I do, it's like what Cindy says, not a one-to-one translation, a direct translation, but the hardest thing to do is this, I think it's a skill, but also a sensitivity to it, is how do you translate the feeling, right, and the kind of the affect of the words.
In regards to name, I chose my name in 3rd grade, and I thought it was like the most unique name, like no one's ever invented it, and I sincerely chose it because if I signed my name, Cindy, I could put a Y and then put a heart over the I, and I was just like, this is, no one's ever thought of this. This is the brilliant thing ever. So I went in as Cindy. In Vietnam, people call me Candy. I don't know what, they see Cindy and they think Candy, so it's fine. I'm Candy in Vietnam. But then I went to a theater workshop once, and then part of this was like, you have to introduce ourselves, and then I introduced myself. And the theater person, or director, was just like, no, what's your real name? Ooh. And then I was just like, this was like one of my first theater exercises. It was like, I'm Cindy. And then she was like, no, what's your real name? And then she's like, claim your name, claim your name. It was like a very intense thing. And then I went home being like, have I just like accepted this like, I don't know, whitewashing of my identity as a 3rd grader, and I just like embraced it, or what? And then I realized, and I had to make a claim, and I appreciate that moment. It was a big learning moment for me. Because for me, like my mom calls me Kim, which is my Viet name. Eric calls me Kim, and it's like it's something for me, like a special part of my language repertoire that I'm actually really proud that I chose my name as Cindy, and that my parents trusted me to choose my name. And it just shows something about kind of me being Vietnamese American, and having authority over what people call me.
I just want to say both of your presentations were absolutely beautiful. I'm going to start crying because I always do. And my son's laughing at me because he knows. I guess I have so many questions, and I'm actually writing a book about Heason and family life and what all that means. But I think I'm curious also, or I guess I'm really struck that both of you didn't mention your dads, and it almost sounds familiar, but very interesting, and I wonder if you could talk about that. But then the other thing I just want to say before it, because I think it ought to be said, like translation is so difficult. It's not, many people are bilingual. But to translate is a really special, it's an art, and it's a skill, and it's something you have to be almost a genius, I think, with words and with feelings in both languages to kind of get at what each language is doing, and to have some kind of commensuration between the two of them. And I think it's such a beautiful job. So thank you.
Okay. So my dad is actually an absent present in all of my work. So I didn't grow up with a typical sort of immigrant parents pushing kids to do like engineering or whatever. My dad, actually, his wish was that my sisters, I have two sisters, that's the three of us, would at some point become the Brontes, right? And that's because my dad, he has a very deep and strong love for literature. And I have absorbed some of that through osmosis and genetic, I guess. But I think in many ways, none of this relationship to language to movements could be possible without him. So for example, my family moved to the US because my dad had served in the South Vietnamese military. And after the war, he was imprisoned in a re-education camp, so for 3 years. And because of that, in the late 80s and the early 90s, there was a program that allowed South Vietnamese military personnel to come to the US with their family. And so that predicated my first displacement, so to speak. Right? But even in those moments, I always felt like as a figure in the home, he anchors Vietnam for me, even though we left. So yeah, so there is an absent, I think, in this, but without him, none of this would have seen.
I don't know how to talk about my dad without crying. I'll share just a few stories, I think. So when my family was fleeing Vietnam by boat, my mom was pregnant, but she didn't know. I'm going to grapple with these just in case. So my mom was pregnant with me and she didn't know. So it was my father, my mother, my older sister who was about 3 or 4, and then my older brother who was about 2 or 3. And then we were on the boat. You're allotted like a really tiny spot to sit on top of the deck. And my dad, being like bigger and stronger, he got a job basically. I don't really know how boats work, but how my mom explains how boats work, he was doing engine stuff. Like, I don't know what that means. I don't think it's shoveling coal, but I think it's tending to the engine. And the reason why he took that job, even though it was really hard, was because he got a supply of water. So then my father would essentially keep the supply of water in his mouth and then give the water to my family. Excuse me. And I just remember that like visceral feeling of him sacrificing his portion of water for the rest of the family. And it's excuse me, how I think about my relationship to my father. Kind of he doesn't really, I didn't learn my language through him, but I learned a lot about peace and sacrifice through him. And what is really empowering, I think, back to the 3 points I had regarding translation as power, its healing, and gratitude, is that I wrote my first piece about my father recently called Bad 2303, where I basically rewrote this experience I had when I was young, when my father was held at gunpoint and robbed from the coin laundry we ran, and we as a kid, we had to like be the mediators or the translators between us and the police, because like we had the surveillance footage, but then we spoke English the best in our family, so then we were in charge of like writing down what happened to explain it to the police. So here I was at like, I don't know, somewhere between age 7 to 10, like re-witnessing my dad being held at gunpoint through surveillance footage. But like, to do that, I had to like so distantly separate myself from, that's my dad. It's actually, we are in charge of doing something really important for the family. So then I kind of forgot about that memory until very recently, and I think I was reading something about how in a lot of immigrant families there's experiences of violence that basically get internalized, because that's either through social economic experiences, like that's the situation you're living in. And I was like, oh yeah, I remember that experience. And then I still couldn't process what that meant. So I rewrote kind of a fictitious retelling of that story based on like, by the second level. And then all the different versions of what I thought happened, what I wanted to happen, which is like my dad coming in and like fighting off the bad guys, or like and like delivering justice, but like actually it was just like a really sad footage where it's just like he loses his money and then he just continues working, and that's the story. So through writing that piece, it felt like so healing for me, so much healing for me, because I was able to like understand and process kind of all the different renditions of my father as hero, as human, as victim, and as just provider. And I thought, it's hard to write about dads. I think it's something about like a lot of us being raised by our moms and our language of expression being passed on through mothers too. I mean, like, it's called like maternal language or mother language, thing that damn, for a reason. We spend a lot of time with our moms. And that makes it maybe, I feel very grateful for that, because that's a privilege to be able to communicate with my mother. Dads, he's in my book. It's just like, it's hard. It's just tricky. Thanks for asking me.
I was just interested in different approaches as far as your process for translating the work of others, and if that's English to Vietnamese or Vietnamese to English, or kind of all the different directions versus your own work. And if you could just speak about that process.
Yeah, so I usually, it's a couple of passes for me once I receive a work, and I don't usually sign up to do just any translation work. But I would read the entire thing first, and I would leave it aside and then process it and try to think, okay, what is it saying? What are some of the key things that the work is trying to communicate? And then I go back to it, and in the first pass, what I do is I do a rough translation, so that I can capture the main point I perceive was what is being said. And then the third pass would go back and do a direct translation, so separate, like direct translation. And the fourth pass is to combine those, because sometimes, translating especially complex concepts, the words can sound very technical once you do the translation, and it doesn't really do that job for you. And what I find has been really helpful for me is right now is trying to translate text in Buddhism, and that is incredibly difficult because the contents of Buddhist texts are based on the ancient Sanskrit translated into Sino form, translated into Sino-Vietnamese form, and translated into modern Vietnamese. And so that's like a brain exercise, and it requires, right? So I have like giant dictionaries all the way around, and my dad supplied the dictionaries. But yeah, so that's just kind of the process, because I understand it not as an economic work, but as a learning process for me, right? And I relish in the fact that when the work is done, people feel like their work is being sort of appreciated through the work that I do. So I'm just the intermediary. So a quick story was, I mentioned I subtitled for Sea Drift, the documentary film, and Sea Drift was actually shown at the Vietnamese International Festival that Cindy's film was shown, and the director is a Chinese American. And at the end of the day, he had asked the audience what they thought of the translation, because the audience watched it through Vietnamese subtitles. And one of the audience members came up to him and said, "Oh, I love the part when the bad words were translated." Like, it's children here, so I won't repeat what the word is. But for the audience member, like the Vietnamese translation of that sort of moment, just like hit the spot.
What was the Vietnamese word?
I won't tell you either.
Oh man. Man.
But I mean, that's like for me, it's like, okay, and I really had a hard time for like those 3 words, trying to figure out like what do I want to put there, right? But yeah, that's just, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I just I've only undertaken a few like professional translation jobs.
Sontag.
Oh yeah, I did. I forgot that. Oh, that was a weird one. I ended up translating like archive. Okay, Susan Sontag did a trip to Hanoi during the war, and she was one of the few representatives from the U.S. who experienced Hanoi during the conflict. And then she wrote about it, called "Trip to Hanoi," and she writes how the Vietnamese people are extremely peaceful and want independence and whatnot. So it was very much used as an anti-war part of the anti-war movement in the U.S. But the Vietnamese northern government also reported a lot about her trip and also translated pieces of her report that she wrote in English into Vietnamese. And then I had to translate that into English for Benjamin Moser, who wrote a biography of Susan Sontag. So that was like many levels of translation that was happening. And it was really hard because I think there were multiple levels of translation, but there was also like all these politics that was happening within each word that was used. And then like, how much of this do I want in the English version of which I knew was going into a biography about Sontag and then my own interpretation of Sontag? So after that, I kind of stopped taking jobs just because I was just like, this is too much like theory of, because my translation is going to inform how Benjamin Moser understands Susan Sontag. I mean, in a tiny part about her understanding of Vietnam. And it was too exhausting, and I felt not quite prepared for that. So at this point, I'm more interested in translation as a creative exercise and making art about translation. And then even in this, I think in this essay, it was the first time I'm writing parts in Vietnamese, which I've never written before. And that was a different practice. And I'm really excited for that new frontier. It's like and all the mistranslations that happen because I'm like attempting to write in this bilingual way. But I thought this could be a nice segue into our translation activity, which is really so much informed by a continuation of our conversation about translation as playful, as tentative, as this creative exercise. So it's a pretty quick activity, and we really hope that like through this talk you kind of come to learn different types of practices.